07:42 a.m. over New Guinea, July 1942. The sky is a shredded canvas of oil-black smoke and flashes of sunlight. A single F4F Wildcat veers hard left, blood and adrenaline pumping through the veins of its pilot, Lieutenant Johnny Sutherland. A Zero, sleek and menacing, slips in behind him, the roar of its engine vibrating through the air like a predator closing in for the kill. Johnny's breath comes in rapid gasps as his wings shudder. The cockpit shakes, and his eyes flicker to his fuel gauge, half empty. "No time," he mutters. He rips the stick back, yanking his Wildcat into an impossible climb. The Zero follows, its wings slicing through the air with deadly precision. Suddenly, Johnny rolls the Wildcat upside down. For a split second, everything freezes. The Zero above, its pilot's eyes wide with disbelief. Johnny grins, feels the sudden pull of gravity. The Zero is weightless. It stalls, and then the Zero's engine sputters, cuts. A miracle, a breakthrough. By the 4th of July 1942, Midway Atoll had become a proving ground written in fuel consumption reports and sortie tallies. The heat pressed down on the coral strip like a weight, shimmering off aluminum fuselages and turning cockpits into ovens before takeoff. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch stood near the operations tent, watching his pilots return from morning patrol, their Grumman F4F4 Wildcats settling onto the runway with that characteristic heavy bounce. The Wildcat was a workhorse designed by Leroy Grumman's team with a focus on structural integrity and firepower. 6 Browning M2 machine guns, armor plating behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, but against the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, it was outmatched in maneuverability. The Zero could turn inside American fighters, a fact confirmed in after-action reports from Coral Sea and early Midway engagements. Thatch had studied those reports carefully. Zeros achieved turn rates near 17 degrees per second at optimal speed. The Wildcat managed 13 at best. In a turning fight, that difference measured the space between survival and a smoking crater in the Pacific. The morning's patrol had lost 2 planes. Radio logs recorded the last transmissions, altitude calls, then silence. Thatch knew what that meant. His pilots were dying because they fought the way they'd been trained, in maneuvers designed for aircraft that no longer existed. Something had to change, and the evidence was mounting in maintenance logs few bothered to read. By July 6th, the pattern had become undeniable to those who paid attention to details. Aviation machinists, Mate First Class Robert L. Anderson crouched beside a Wildcat's engine cowling, his hands black with oil, the smell of hot metal and aviation fuel thick in the humid air. He'd been tracking a problem for weeks, one that appeared in operational reports as minor engine irregularities during high G maneuvers. The Pratt & Whitney R1830-86 radial engine was reliable, 14 cylinders, delivering 1200 horsepower. But its Stromberg NAS3A1 carburetor had been designed for aircraft operating in relatively level flight. Under negative G-forces, when a pilot pushed the nose down hard or rolled inverted, fuel delivery stuttered. The float chamber couldn't maintain proper fuel levels when gravity reversed. Anderson had documented this in his maintenance logs, noting engine cutouts lasting 2 to 5 seconds during aggressive defensive maneuvers. For a pilot trying to escape a Zero's guns, 5 seconds was an eternity. He'd reported it up the chain. The response came back stamped with priority codes that meant it would be investigated eventually, somewhere far from Midway's coral and heat. Lieutenant Thatch found Anderson that afternoon, drawn by rumors that someone actually understood why Wildcats kept losing power at critical moments. "Show me," Thatch said. Anderson walked him through the carburetor's operation, explaining fuel starvation under inverted flight. Thatch listened, his jaw tight. "And the Zeros don't have this problem?" Anderson shook his head. "They use direct fuel injection, sir. Works under any orientation." The pieces were connecting in Thatch's mind, forming a tactical solution. The strike order came through on July 7th, transmitted from CINCPAC headquarters and logged at 05 to 15 hours. VF-3, Thatch's fighter squadron, would provide top cover for a reconnaissance mission northeast of Midway. Intelligence suggested Japanese carriers might still be operating in the area, though the main battle had concluded days earlier. Thatch briefed his pilots in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces illuminated by the glow of cigarettes and dim electric bulbs. The air smelled of coffee and nervous sweat. He kept the briefing factual. Expected course, patrol altitude, fuel calculations, emergency procedures. He did not mention the carburetor problem. There was nothing to be done about it now except fly smarter. By 07 hours, 6 Wildcats were airborne, climbing through broken clouds into a sky that stretched empty and blue in every direction. The formation held tight, engines droning in synchronized rhythm. Radio chatter remained minimal, crisp call signs and position reports. Then, at 07:38, the call came. "Bogies, 2 o'clock high, 4 miles. Thatch spotted them immediately, 4 Zeros in a loose finger 4 formation, probably stragglers from a carrier group. His pulse remained steady as he keyed the radio. "Scissors on my mark. Stay disciplined." The Zeros turned toward them, descending with that characteristic grace, sunlight glinting off their polished cowlings. Thatch knew what would happen next. His pilots would want to turn with them, to fight the way instinct demanded. That was how Americans had been dying. He waited until the range closed to 1,500 yards, then gave the order. Execute. What followed would be recorded in after-action reports as the first documented use of what would later be called the Thach Weave. The maneuver appeared deceptively simple in the official description filed 3 days later. 2 Wildcats flew parallel courses separated by approximately 200 yards. When an enemy fighter committed to one aircraft, both American planes turned toward each other, crossing paths. The pursuer, expecting to follow a fleeing target, suddenly faced a second Wildcat head-on, forcing a defensive break. The mathematics worked because the Zero's advantage disappeared in head-on geometry. Turn rate didn't matter when closure speeds exceeded 500 knots. Thatch and his wingman, Ensign Robert A.M. Dibb, executed the first cross at 07:41 hours. The Zero pursuing Dibb found itself staring at Thatch's 6 machine guns at 300 yards. The Japanese pilot broke hard right, abandoning his attack. Thatch didn't fire. He maintained his turn, knowing Dibb would cross back, that the pattern would repeat. It did. The Zeros tried to adapt, splitting their formation, attempting vertical maneuvers. But the Weave held them at bay, denying the turning fight that would favor Japanese aircraft. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. No American aircraft were damaged. 1 Zero was claimed as a probable seen trailing smoke as it departed eastward. The after-action report, filed by Thatch at 14:30 that afternoon, noted the tactical effectiveness with characteristic understatement. Mutual support tactics proved advantageous against superior turning enemy aircraft. What the report didn't capture was the exhaustion, the constant awareness that one mistake would unravel the entire formation, or the fuel gauges dropping toward reserve as pilots fought to maintain position. They landed at 08:52 hours, fuel drums reading nearly empty. Thatch climbed from his cockpit, legs unsteady, and walked directly to the operations tent to begin documenting what had just been proven. While Thatch drafted his tactical report, Anderson and his maintenance crew worked through the afternoon heat on a solution they'd been developing quietly. The carburetor problem couldn't be fixed without parts that didn't exist on Midway, but it could be mitigated. Anderson had studied the technical manuals for the Stromberg carburetor, cross-referencing them with British reports on similar issues in Hurricane fighters. The British had experimented with negative G carburetors, adding a second fuel line that activated under inverted flight. Anderson didn't have the parts for that modification, but he had an idea. By adjusting the float chamber's fuel level slightly higher and modifying the needle valve tension, he could reduce the duration of fuel starvation during negative G maneuvers. It wouldn't eliminate the problem, but it might cut those 5 seconds to 2. He tested the modification on 3 aircraft over the next 2 days, running them through ground tests and short flights with volunteer pilots who deliberately induced negative G conditions. The results appeared in his maintenance log. Modified carburetor settings reduced power interruption duration approximately 60% during inverted flight tests. Recommend fleet-wide implementation pending further evaluation. The log entry was dated July 9th. By July 10th, 12 Wildcats on Midway carried the modification. Thatch learned about it through the informal network that connected good pilots to good mechanics. He found Anderson near the fuel dump that evening, the sun setting red across the Pacific. "Does it work?" Thatch asked. Anderson wiped his hands on a rag stained with months of labor. "Better than before, sir." "Not perfect," Thatch nodded. "Perfect gets people killed waiting for it. Better is enough." The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but it represented something larger. The American capacity to adapt under pressure, to solve problems with available resources rather than ideal solutions. The tactical evolution continued through mid-July as Thatch refined the weave and distributed detailed instructions to other fighter squadrons. His report reached Fighter Command on July 12th, transmitted via naval communications and marked for immediate distribution. By July 15th, typed copies circulated among Marine and Navy fighter squadrons across the Pacific. The document ran 4 pages, illustrated with hand-drawn diagrams showing aircraft positions, crossing angles, and timing sequences. It emphasized discipline and mutual trust. Each pilot must maintain absolute confidence that his wingman will execute the cross at the designated moment. Hesitation or early maneuvering compromises the formation's integrity. The weave required practice. Squadrons spent hours flying the pattern until it became instinctive, until pilots could execute crosses without conscious thought while tracking enemy aircraft and monitoring fuel, ammunition, and engine instruments simultaneously. By late July, after action reports began documenting its effectiveness across multiple engagements, VF6, operating from Enterprise, reported successful defensive actions against Zero formations on July 18th. VMF 223, a Marine squadron on Guadalcanal, credited the weave with preventing losses during a bomber escort mission on July 23rd. The tactical shift showed in the numbers. In June 1942, before Midway and before the weave, Navy and Marine fighter squadrons reported loss-to-kill ratios averaging 1.4 to 1 against Zeros. By August, that ratio had improved to 0.8 to 1. The Zero remained a superior aircraft in many respects, but American pilots had found a way to neutralize its primary advantage. They stopped trying to turn with it. The weave, combined with Anderson's carburetor modifications and growing pilot experience, created a tactical framework that emphasized American strengths: teamwork, firepower, and structural durability. In the maintenance logs and tactical reports, a pattern emerged that would define the Pacific Air War. American forces learning faster than their opponents expected. The improbable statistic appeared in a Navy Bureau of Aeronautics summary dated August 4, 1942. Of the 168 F4F Wildcats deployed to Pacific squadrons between June and July, 71 had been lost to all causes. Of those losses, only 23 were attributed to air-to-air combat with 0 fighters, a dramatic reduction from earlier months when combat losses comprised over 60% of total casualties. The remainder were operational losses, crashes, accidents, mechanical failures unrelated to combat. The data suggested something the frontline pilots already knew. They'd stopped dying in turning fights, but numbers alone didn't capture what that meant to the men who flew. Lieutenant Edward H. O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient for actions earlier in the year, flew Wildcats from Maui during this period, training replacement pilots in the Weave before they deployed forward. He described the tactical shift in a letter to his wife dated July 27th. "The kids coming through now have a chance. We're teaching them to fight smart instead of brave." The distinction mattered. Bravery without tactics produced casualties. The Weave gave pilots a framework that channeled courage into effectiveness. By late August, the tactical doctrine had been formalized in CINCPAC Fighter Directive 4208, distributed to all Pacific Fleet fighter squadrons. The directive specified standard formations, engagement protocols, and training requirements. It codified what Thatch, Anderson, and dozens of other pilots and mechanics had developed through necessity and improvisation. The Zero's dominance, which had seemed absolute in early 1942, had been checked not by a superior aircraft, but by superior adaptation. American fighters still couldn't turn with Zeros, still lost individual dogfights when pilots forgot their training. But squadrons that flew the Weave, maintained their discipline, and trusted their mechanics survived. They survived, and slowly they began to win. The strategic implications rippled outward through the late summer of 1942. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war with approximately 400 highly trained carrier pilots, suffered irreplaceable losses at Midway and in subsequent engagements. American training pipelines, meanwhile, accelerated. The Navy's flight training program graduated 10,569 pilots in 1942, compared to 879 in 1940. Not all would fly fighters, but the numbers reflected industrial and institutional capacity that Japan couldn't match, and now those pilots were learning tactics that worked. Lieutenant Commander James H. Flatley, commanding officer of VF-10, implemented the Weave in August and reported results that validated Thatcher's approach. In a series of engagements near Guadalcanal between August 24th and September 5th, VF-10 claimed 14 Zero kills against 3 Wildcat losses, a ratio that would have been impossible 3 months earlier. Flatley's after-action reports emphasized the same elements: discipline, mutual support, refusing to fight on Japanese terms. The Weave wasn't perfect. It required fuel, burning through reserves as pilots maneuvered constantly. It couldn't pursue effectively, allowing damaged enemy aircraft to escape. It worked best with experienced pilots who could maintain formation under fire. But it kept pilots alive long enough to become experienced, breaking the cycle where new replacements died before learning to fight. By September, the tactical landscape had shifted measurably. Japanese commanders noted the change in captured documents and interrogation reports. The Americans were fighting differently, they observed, with less individual aggression but greater formation cohesion. The reports recommended counter-tactics, vertical maneuvers to break formations, attacks from the sun to disrupt coordination. Some worked occasionally, none restored the Zero's early war dominance. The Pacific Air War had entered a new phase, one where American material advantages and tactical innovation began to matter more than the elegant maneuverability of Japanese fighters. The moment of transition, when old assumptions finally collapsed under accumulated evidence, can sometimes be identified in the archives. For the Zero's reputation as invincible, that moment appeared in intelligence summaries compiled between August and October 1942. ONI Report 42J, dated September 17th, analysed 53 separate fighter engagements in the Solomon Islands theatre. The report concluded, "The A6M Zero fighter retains superior manoeuvrability and rate of climb compared to F4F aircraft. However, these advantages have proven insufficient to achieve air superiority when opposed by properly trained and tactically disciplined American formations." The language was careful, bureaucratic. It acknowledged Japanese capabilities while declaring them inadequate. The psychological shift mattered as much as the tactical one. American pilots in June had feared the Zero, had considered it nearly unbeatable in close combat. By October, they respected it, but no longer considered combat inevitable defeat. Confidence spread through ready rooms and maintenance areas, reflected in casual remarks and mission logs. Pilots discussed Zeros the way they discussed weather or mechanical problems. Factors to account for, not insurmountable obstacles. The change showed in operational planning. Strike missions began accepting higher risk profiles, knowing fighter escorts could hold their own against interception. Bombing accuracy improved when pilots didn't expect to lose half the escort on each mission. The cumulative effect compounded. Better escort meant more effective strikes. More effective strikes meant degraded Japanese air capabilities. Degraded Japanese capabilities meant even better survival rates for American fighters. By late October, the loss-to-kill ratio had improved to 0.6 to 1. For every 3 American fighters lost, 5 Zeros went down. The mathematics of attrition, which had favoured Japan in early 1942, had reversed, and Japan's pilot training system, designed for quality over quantity, couldn't sustain losses at these rates. The Americans had found the breaking point and were applying pressure systematically. The documented encounter on October 26, 1942, during the Battle of Santa Cruz, illustrated how completely tactics had evolved. VF-10, flying from Enterprise, engaged a formation of 12 Zeros, escorting Japanese dive bombers at 11:47 hours. The combat lasted 14 minutes. American pilots maintained the weave throughout, crossing and recrossing as Zeros attempted to break formation integrity. The after-action report, filed by Lieutenant Commander Flatley, recorded the sequence with clinical precision. At 11:49, engaged lead enemy fighters, executed standard cross, enemy broke vertical, followed into second cross. Enemy attempted stern attack on section leader, third cross forced defensive break, pattern repeated. The pattern always repeated. That was the point. Zeros could initiate attacks but couldn't sustain them against coordinated defense. The engagement ended when Japanese fighters broke off to preserve fuel. VF-10 claimed 6 Zeros destroyed, 2 probables. 2 Wildcats returned with damage. None were lost. The mathematics had become predictable, almost mechanical. One particularly striking detail appeared in Lieutenant Stanley Swede, Veitassa's personal account of the engagement. Veitassa, who had previously flown dive bombers, had transitioned to fighters in September. On October 26th, he shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, a feat that would earn him the Navy Cross. But his account emphasized not individual dogfighting, but adherence to tactical doctrine. Stayed with my section, waited for the crosses, took shots when geometry aligned. Never chased. 7 kills, following those principles against an enemy that had dominated the Pacific sky 6 months earlier. The record spoke to how thoroughly the tactical landscape had shifted, how completely American adaptation had neutralized Japanese advantages through systematic application of teamwork and discipline. The cost of this adaptation appeared in the human details beneath the tactical summaries. Lieutenant Edward H. Butch O'Hare, who had helped train pilots in the Weave, was killed in action on November 26, 1943. His Hellcat lost during a night fighter mission near Tarawa. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch survived the war, eventually rising to admiral and helping develop jet fighter tactics in the 1950s. Aviation machinists mate Robert L. Anderson served through 1945. His carburetor modifications eventually superseded by factory improvements, but credited in maintenance records as field expedient solution that saved lives pending official fix. The Wildcat itself served through 1945, eventually supplemented and then replaced by the F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair, aircraft that incorporated lessons learned in blood during 1942. But the tactical framework developed at Midway endured. The Weave evolved into doctrine, taught to every Navy and Marine fighter pilot. Its principles, mutual support, disciplined formation flying, refusing to fight on enemy terms, shaped American fighter tactics through Korea and Vietnam. The physical artifacts scattered across museum hangars and private collections. A Wildcat at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, another at the Smithsonian, a third at Pearl Harbor. They look small and ungainly compared to modern fighters, their radial engines and stubby wings speaking to an earlier era of aerial combat. But they represented something beyond their technical specifications. They were the aircraft that held the line when the outcome remained uncertain, that gave pilots a chance to learn and survive, that proved adaptation mattered more than initial superiority. In the maintenance logs from Midway, Anderson's careful notations about fuel flow and carburetor settings marked the moment when American ingenuity confronted a tactical crisis and improvised a solution. The strategic assessment compiled in December 1942 by CINCPAC staff quantified what had been achieved. Between June and November, Navy and Marine fighter squadrons had engaged in 287 documented air-to-air combats in the Pacific Theater. American pilots claimed 612 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 278 American losses, a ratio of 2.2 to 1. The numbers included all aircraft types, not just Zeros versus Wildcats, but the trend was unmistakable. American forces had achieved air superiority through tactical evolution and industrial capacity. The Zero remained in service through 1945, its basic design unchanged, because Japanese industry lacked the resources to develop and produce a replacement. American aircraft designers, meanwhile, created the Hellcat specifically to dominate the Zero, incorporating armor, firepower, and speed, while accepting reduced maneuverability. The Hellcat achieved a combat ratio of 19 to 1, an almost absurd superiority that reflected both aircraft quality and pilot training. But the Hellcat's success built on foundations laid by Wildcat pilots who survived long enough to teach the next generation. The cost appeared in the casualty lists, the names accumulating through 1942 and beyond. VF-3, Thatch's squadron, lost 47 pilots killed in action during the war. VF-10 lost 34. VMF-223 lost 42. Each loss was recorded, documented, mourned. Each represented a failure of the system to protect the men it sent into combat. But the losses would have been worse, catastrophically worse, without the tactical adaptations that emerged from crisis. The archives preserve the evidence, maintenance logs, tactical reports, after-action summaries, all written in the spare language of military documentation. Between the lines, though, the human story emerges, of pilots learning to trust, Each other, mechanics solving problems with improvised solutions, commanders willing to abandon doctrine when reality proved it inadequate. The sun set over Midway Atoll on December 15th, 1942, painting the Pacific in shades of red and gold. The coral runway, scarred by months of operations, lay quiet in the evening light. 6 Wildcats sat on the hardstand, their engines cooling, metal contracting with soft ticking sounds. The battle for Midway had been won 6 months earlier, decided in 5 minutes of dive bombing that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. But the longer battle, the one fought in maintenance tents and tactical briefings, in the disciplined crosses of the weave and the careful adjustments of carburetor needles, had taken months to resolve. It wasn't decided by a single engagement, but by accumulated adaptations, by men who looked at problems and refused to accept defeat as inevitable. The tactical reports filed from Midway between July and December told that story in careful detail. They documented what worked and what failed, what could be improved and what had to be endured. They became the foundation for doctrine that spread across the Pacific, that trained thousands of pilots in tactics that kept them alive. In the archives now, those reports sit in acid-free folders, the paper yellowing, but the words still legible. They speak to a particular moment when American forces faced an opponent with superior equipment and extensive combat experience, and found ways to win anyway. Not through miracle weapons or overwhelming numbers, not initially. They won through adaptation, through the willingness to change tactics based on evidence, through the cooperation between pilots and mechanics who understood that survival required more than courage. The file on the Wildcat closes without drama, with simple metrics. Sorties flown, aircraft lost, lessons learned. But the numbers had already changed the war, had proven that tactical innovation could overcome material disadvantage, that American forces could learn and adapt faster than their opponents expected. The legacy endured long after the last Wildcat left frontline service.